We can make a start. We're now on live. Just the normal notice to begin with that the meeting is to be webcast for live or subsequent broadcast. And if there are public present, which at the moment we do not have, press or public may record and take photographs. They're confidential or exempt items. Could I move to apologies? Have I any? No. Declarations of interest. The normal, except there's a paragraph in there which has appeared recently. Advised of in relation to the council meeting. I might discuss with a few people afterwards. But there we are. Action notes is what follows on. That's the meeting of the 27th of January. Anything there? Can we agree those? Thank you very much. The item 5 is the tracker. And those are being followed through. Is there anything, Christian, you want to say about any of those?
No, just I think the action for Councillor Cotton to meet with Councillor Lau in relation to Travers, I think, has taken place.
I've sent the report across my promise to the last meeting. I know that we're following on the response on that taken as well.
Yeah, so that hasn't gone, that wasn't included on today's tracker, but it's just an additional update for you.
Okay. Any members got anything to raise there? No. Okay, that takes us very quickly on then to item 6, and we took the decision some while ago that this would be a one subject meeting, namely consideration of the domestic abuse prevention strategy. And can I thank those members, Sharon, you're Idris, you're sitting in the right place. No, it's mixed. Oh, okay. Can I thank those members who've brought us to this point, particularly Alex Yip, backed by Kerry Jenkins. Councillor Jan isn't here. I had invited her to be here, and I did think that she might be. Here we are. Right. I think we'll have to. Okay, so we're all here. My job on this part of the agenda is simply to make sure the session runs smoothly, and therefore I'm going to try and keep us to a time schedule, which I've got in front of me, just to make sure that we pay proper attention to different parts of the agenda. And that, by way of introduction, is all that I want to say. The first part of this is to move forward and look at an approach to the review of the domestic abuse prevention strategy and how it is engagement. And I've got two people who are leading on this, as I understand it. Kalvinder Kohli, who is the Assistant Director, Early Intervention and Prevention, and Ravinder Johal, who's the Commissioning Manager for Adult Social Care. I'm presuming Kalvinder is going to come in first. Yes. Some people are on screen, some people are here in attendance.
Brilliant. Good morning, everybody. So if I may just start with a safety briefing, mindful of the fact this is a very sensitive area of work, and we know that it impacts upon our own lives and those that we care about. So this is just a reminder for colleagues, really, that there is support out there. We have a number of commissioned organisations, 3 of which you can see on screen there. So if you do need some support, please do reach out to those organisations, or if you wish to speak to Ravinder or myself, we are also available. Thank you very much. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll move on now. What I want to do is just give you some background and context, because we've been on this journey for some time, and in all, whilst an incredibly sensitive area, we've made some phenomenal progress in the city, but recognising there's an awful lot to do as well. So I think it's good to just do a little bit of a recap before we start to talk about the current process around this strategy review, and then obviously the development of the new strategy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if we just start with some data. So in 2022, domestic abuse was the top reason for people contacting the Children's Trust. So just over 10,000 contacts out of the 58, just over 58,000 in total. And in terms of recorded domestic abuse crime in Birmingham, this has been steadily and significantly increasing. So October 2021 was higher than October 2020, and similarly 2020 was already 42% higher compared to the same period in 2019. It's also the third highest reason for homelessness presentation. And if we look at our commission services, the domestic abuse hub helpline, you can see the increases there. So quite phenomenal increases, over a very, very short period of time, showing that over 300% increase. So it just goes to demonstrate the level of demand in the city. And then if we think about this within the context of particular wards in the city, so the neighbourhoods of Wheelie, Selly Oak, Edgbaston and Peribel saw an increase of reporting over 50% 2019 to 2020. And then similarly, there's the largest increase of 64% witnessed in the neighbourhoods of South Yardley, Handsworth Wood and the Jewellery Quarter. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the existing strategy, so this was agreed by full council in February 2018. The important thing to note about this strategy, it was widely consulted upon and co-designed with a wide range of partners across the city, with elected members and key strategic partners as well. There was a real shift in this strategy as well. Previous strategies had focused on crisis, and we recognise that getting the right help and support within crisis is absolutely important, but we need to make the shift as well in terms of those earlier interventions and the way that we change attitudes within society. So it was seen as a fundamental shift by partner agencies. It also put the marker down in terms of the organisations operating in the city to ask the question, what will you do differently so that we do intervene early, so that we do have an opportunity to prevent wherever we can, and that we do support victims and their children to rebuild their lives after incidences of domestic abuse. The other thing that we did was we were mindful of the fact that, it appears in the top 3 reasons for homelessness presentations that there's an alignment within the domestic abuse prevention strategy and also the homelessness prevention strategy. The 2 strategies were launched in a couple of months of each other. The other thing that it does is it does follow on at its time before the Domestic Abuse Act. It followed the principles of the Homelessness Reduction Act, which also talks about prevention. The partnership approach to the strategy also, in addition to calling for collective action, it requires a whole-scale system change, a change in culture and a change in the way that organisations work as well and operate and respond to victims and their children. Now, this is quite fundamental because in addition to putting the marker down, it really forces organisations to think differently and think about the changes that they need to make to respond to the requirements of the strategy. I think it's fair to say it's bold in ambition. These are some very difficult conversations that we've had to have with organisations, but nevertheless, it's been part of the journey. And what we can say is that there's been absolute unanimous support and backing for this strategy across a range of partner agencies. The other thing to note about this strategy is that it has been borrowed, adapted and replicated by a number of other local authorities who recognise the importance of really getting into that prevention space. And the other thing to note is, the focus of the strategy is very much around women, children and groups that share protected characteristics. And we need to make sure that they are at the centre of any actions that we undertake. Next slide, please. So again, this is a iteration of what I've just said there, but it's recognising that when you look at prevention, you're actually talking about a layered prevention model. So that piece around changing attitudes and behaviours. This is very much around how we change attitudes and behaviours within society, but it's also around starting early. How do we work with children and young people so that they are able to recognise abuse when they experience it and understand and recognise the support that's available to deal with that as well. And then earlier interventions and intervene with their cohorts of populations that they may be working with, and understanding how to get in early, the types and ranges of support that's available, and then recognising when to escalate up in terms of safety and support. And the safety and support element is recognising that good, robust responses around safety and support is what keeps victims safe, and we mustn't lose sight of that. And then the overall arching ambition is making domestic abuse everybody's business, because if it's only when it's everybody's business that we can start to affect the change that's needed. This isn't a Birmingham City Council strategy. It recognises that no one single agency can deliver this. So the partnership element is really strong in terms of promoting that collective action. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what's the scope of the strategy? So as I've said, it's adults, it's children, it's young people who are experiencing or have experienced domestic abuse. It's those with protected characteristics as per the Equality Act, and those who are perpetrating domestic abuse as well, and children that are exposed to domestic abuse, and then the general population for the purposes of prevention more broadly. Thank you. So in terms of some of our key achievements, we've commissioned a longer prevention pathway for providing support to victims. We commissioned the Domestic Abuse Hub, which is a single point of specialist support for women and children. It's readily been recognised as national best practice. The short space of time that the hub's been running, it's had some phenomenal impacts in terms of supporting victims and their children. We've retained our refuge provision for a number of years, and we know a number of local authorities have actually had to cut back on their refuge provision, but we've continued to build upon that refuge provision. We've thought about different delivery models as well, particularly thinking about long-term dispersed models, and also we have a lead worker service for both female and male victims. And then, as you would expect, the landscape is continually changing. So during the life of the current strategy, we've seen finally the introduction of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which brings upon new strategy duties for local authorities and statutory agencies in terms of how we provide support to victims who reside in safe accommodation. What we did in Birmingham was that we were very proactive. We'd seen the draft guidance around pertaining to the legislation, and we set up our shadow board 12 months in advance of the new duty. It was really helpful, simply because soon after, we were in a pandemic, and what that shadow board did was it brought the agency responses together in that point of emergency as we saw rates of domestic abuse rising. So a really important role in terms of the shadow board, and it also meant that we were ready once the duty landed. Now, one of the requirements of the new duties is to undertake a full needs assessment. We did that. We had a current strategy. A number of local authority areas didn't have current DA strategies, but given that ours was only a couple of years in, what we had to do was therefore undertake the needs assessment and then refresh the existing strategy, which we've done. And then obviously alongside the duties came some burdens funding around that, which enabled us to put in place safe accommodation, additional safe accommodation, children's workers, therapeutic counselling sessions, and also family support workers as well. We introduced something called a community grants prospectus. Again, this was in recognition of the fact that the majority of our commissioning in Birmingham was undertaken through a formal tender process, which required organisations to bid and then to be formally issued contracts. But often that excludes smaller grassroots organisations. So we utilised the work that we'd already done through Prevention First within adult social care, where we'd created a community grants prospectus, and we adapted that to enable those smaller organisations to come through, and also to think about some of those more niche services where we wanted to trial and test things as well. And obviously, as part of this, we included a number of really important initiatives that are going to help shape and inform the next strategy, which Ravinder's going to talk about shortly. So this included a coordinator around learning disabilities, also school links workers as well. Next slide, please. Okay, again, some key achievements. We started to think about ourselves as an organisation, so Birmingham City Council and the Children's Trust as an organisation. And what we wanted to do was to put the spotlight on ourselves, to ask ourselves, so what is it that we are doing internally? So we formulated a cross-directorate domestic abuse group, both to look at our HR policies, but also to look at our own systems and processes to see where we could improve things. Also thinking in the context of a HR offer for staff, specialist housing, domestic abuse officers, a sanctuary scheme, and then obviously we are seeking the domestic abuse housing accreditations, which is being led on by our colleagues within housing. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Ravinder now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So just to say that, thanks for giving that kind of overview in terms of the current strategy. In terms of next steps, then really in our approach going forward for the developing the next domestic abuse strategy, one of the things that we want to do is really to stop a moment, because it's very easy to kind of run ahead and sort of like start developing. But we wanted to stop a moment, review and reflect on the current strategy. Consider what's been achieved, and we've covered some of that this week, but also what are the challenges that we've encountered, what we may need to continue sort of like from the old strategy into the new strategy. And Cal touched on some of the areas that we're doing within the City Council. Obviously, this will be across all of the partnerships and across the city, so all of this review will take place with our partners. But our approach, really, the principles around developing the new strategy will essentially build on what we did in the first strategy, really, around ensuring strong partnership involvement, making sure that we've got that continued support in recognition that no one single agency can resolve issues around domestic abuse. And so it is about working together to get that whole system approach. We'll ensure that the Council's corporate priority of prevention and early intervention is embedded in the new strategy. And as Carol mentioned previously, we'll be aligning with the new homelessness prevention strategy and the violence against women and girls strategy that's been developed by our colleagues in safety partnerships. So just to give an example, in terms of the early intervention prevention work, like I say, that was already very much in the initial strategy, but we're looking to strengthen and embed that further. So prevention is very much around that whole life course approach, raising awareness, changing attitudes from a very early age, children, young people through to adults, and that understanding around healthy relationships, equality and respect very much throughout the whole of their lives. Early intervention, very much around intervening as early as possible, really. There is that recognition that if you can intervene as early as possible, you can start to prevent that harm and reduce the impact of domestic abuse on victims. Now, that involves a lot of things, and some examples are really about strengthening our first response. So in every organisation, there's a responsibility that workers are able to identify domestic abuse, spot the signs and intervene early. So it's really important. Improve the effectiveness of our DA support pathways. Cal's touched on some of the commission services that we already have, but going into the next commissioning cycle, we'll look at ways in which we can improve those commission support services. And then also it's about working with trusted professionals and trying to where they encourage victims to share and disclose their experiences about domestic abuse early on. So a recent survey conducted by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office showed that victims are more likely to disclose to health professionals than they are to any other professionals. So it's about working across the health system to make sure that those professionals are trained, they recognise the symptoms and they can encourage victims to disclose. Overview really of the timeline in terms of the work that we've started. So already started some work around the desktop research, building on the needs assessment. I won't necessarily go through all of that. We've already started in terms of a strategic working group, presenting to a number of members. Obviously, the work with scrutiny began before Christmas, so we're continuing that work. What we're looking for is around May time is to have a draft domestic abuse strategy, and we'll be presenting that to the Domestic Abuse Board following the consultation and the workshops. We then look to go out for formal consultation around June, July sort of time. And again, there'll be a series of consultation events and normal Be Heard surveys to get out to the wider public, involving our partners as well across the city. And then the aim is to have an amended version, which then builds on the comments and the work that's ongoing from sort of like November onward. So that we've then got a final to get that into the cycle for improvement. Or while the cabinet reporting is December, so getting that approved by October. So fairly ambitious in terms of the time frame, but that's what we're sort of like looking to do. And then just finally, in terms of some progress, really, the approach that we've outlined has already been approved by the Domestic Abuse Local Strategic Partnership Board. Like I say, we've already commenced the research. We have the needs assessment already, so we're building on that. We're doing some national horizon scanning, looking at what's coming forward in terms of DA. The landscape is always changing, but we're making sure that we're ahead of it. We've started to present to relevant cabinet members to make sure that they're aware of the approach. Obviously, today's part of this cross-grouping involvement. As mentioned, there's a strategic working group that will look at developing the strategy. That's chaired by Graham Tilby, Assistant Director of the Children's Trust, and it's a cross-partnership. And then we're also starting to attend senior management teams as well. So we're doing the engagement as much as we can across the council, and we're also then seeking support from colleagues across directorates to go into their management teams to raise the strategy and get feedback from them. And then similarly, we'll be saying that to our colleagues in health, in various partnerships, into their organisations as well, and trying to get that conversation started, the current strategy, and then issues to take forward into the new strategy.
Okay, thank you very much, Ravinda, and thank you also, Kalvinda, for that first statement. I want to move it on straight on. And bring in Emily Owen, who's the Student Wellbeing and Partnership Officer at the University of Birmingham, so one of the partners, if you like, that's just been referred to, and also Maureen Connolly, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Birmingham and Solihull Women's Aid Organisation, and Maureen was part of the original working group, so is well familiar with what it is being discussed this morning. So without further delay, can I ask Emily, we've got 20 minutes for this session, just asking speakers to keep their contributions so that we can get both contributions in within 20 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, my name's Emily. I'm from the University of Birmingham, work within Wellbeing Services, and thank you for inviting me along today to share some of the work that we're doing at the university. I'm joined as well by James, who is on the call, so he'll be kind of available to answer any questions with me. So yeah, next slide, please, Shirin. So just to give some information about the University of Birmingham, some of you may be familiar, but just to kind of give some numbers around our student and staff population. So we have over 38,000 students at the university and 8,000 staff, so a huge kind of, staff and student community. 85% of our student population are aged between 18 to 25, and we are kind of spread across 5 different colleges, and many based on our Edgbaston campus, and we're the 4th largest university within the UK. So in terms of kind of stats around domestic abuse, we know that our student and staff community will be affected by these issues. Next slide, thank you. Just in terms of how we support our student community, the university has kind of within over the last 10 years really made a commitment and investment in wellbeing support for students. So we have what we call a wellbeing network, which is made up of 20 different departments and services that spread across the university. So we see wellbeing as being kind of everybody's responsibility. It's a cross-institutional response, and we have specific roles in all kind of key areas across the university that support with student wellbeing, from college wellbeing officers to a campus police officer, to kind of wellbeing services that offer more kind of specialist support. So it's a really integral part of student experience. Next slide, please, Shirin. Just in terms of the service that I and myself and James work in, we're a small team within wellbeing and within our main central student services. We have four key areas of responsibility. First area is around supporting vulnerable students. So we have some really robust escalation processes in place at the university so that there is that early identification of needs or wellbeing support, and escalation processes that's there for staff to raise concerns about students. Within that area of work, we do specialise in looking at the university's response to issues around domestic abuse and sexual violence, and we've done a lot of work in this area over the past kind of 6 or 7 years, obviously, which has been in line with the domestic abuse prevention strategy, and something that kind of we are keen to keep a strategic priority within the university. Another key area is training development, so our wellbeing network that we've just spoke about. We offer a wellbeing development plan, which offers bespoke training around certain areas, and we've really concentrated in the last year around domestic abuse. Partnerships is key. We're an education provider at the end of the day, and that's kind of we rely on our partnerships both across the university and external to the university to enhance the support of our students and allow them to be able to have those referral pathways into specialist support. And our final area is around non-traditional student vulnerabilities, which is around supporting students that may be care experienced, estranged or young adult carers. Next slide, please, Shirin. So just to kind of give an insight really into the kind of student journey through support at the university, and looking at that kind of the wellbeing network are there to educate, they interact with students on a daily basis, they're there to pick up and identify any issues, students in distress, and also be a key point of contact if students would want to disclose any issues. They then would, depending on their needs, depending on their kind of presentation, they would move through those support services, just ensuring that they get to the right service at the right time. So they'd move through the wellbeing network onto our wellbeing officers, who would be able to make a more thorough assessment of needs, through to our kind of professional wellbeing services, and then on to secondary services and crisis services, probably within the community. So that's kind of the pathway of support. Next. So just in terms of the work that we've done, and I suppose in line with the strategy, like I said, we did the universities, and this was really across the sector around 5 or 6 years ago, did an internal audit. Universities recommendations came out around universities tackling issues like domestic abuse and the responsibility and duty of care that we have to our student and staff population. So in terms of University of Birmingham, we really took on those recommendations and started embedding the support and some mechanisms allowing students to kind of to disclose. So we've around that kind of changing attitudes and behaviours piece. We've run many campaigns over the last kind of 4 or 5 years to raise that awareness within our community, through from kind of more specific campaigns with partnerships like Roshni, with other, and also looking at kind of across the sector and across the region, working with other universities across the city. Also around education piece with students. So we offer an online consent matters e-learning course which students have to complete before they come to university. That very much looks at consent, healthy relationships, and kind of just continuing any education that they've had prior to coming to university. We use key university events to raise awareness and also to bring in our partners to showcase their services. Key events like Welcome, where students engage really well with that activity. We kind of are able, this year, we're able to engage around 10,000 students through our wellbeing marquee, where we invite many partners to come in and talk about these issues and raise the profile of these issues. We introduced this year, this academic year, we've introduced a community safety team, which is a subsequent team through our security team, and they're there to kind of provide a community safety hub to our students, but also kind of raise and go out and engage with students, go out into the community, engaging students. So again, that's around kind of changing attitudes and behaviour. Next slide, please, Sharon. In terms of that early identification and help, so the early intervention side, we very much focus on training and upskilling staff across the university to be able to recognise students kind of in distress, or recognise students who may be being subjected to issues like domestic abuse, and refer appropriately. So we put on training which we call Recognise and Refer. That's been running for the past 4 years. It's open to any staff, so all our staff across the university can go on to that, and we've had a real engagement through academic staff, and that is purely there to kind of be able to identify the need for that support and then refer into more specialist services. We have just implemented a system called Report and Support, which is purely there for staff and students to report and disclose issues around domestic abuse, purely for seeking support in those areas. If they fill out and they seek support through that mechanism, they then will speak to a trained specialist member of staff within the university. For the past 4 years, we've seen an increase in our disclosures. That's really positive for a university. We want our students to come forward. We want to build that trust and confidence within the university that, you know, they will be supported, they will be understood, and they will have those options of support. And the university can help, obviously, kind of with that more in-depth assessment of need. Staff, in terms of kind of HR, have done some work around providing a framework for staff who are subjected to domestic abuse. That's very much guidance for managers. And we have a domestic abuse ally scheme where staff can attend and become an ally. They can be a point of contact for their colleagues. And again, I've just mentioned the community safety team, but it's an integral part of what we do around this area of work. Next. So around the safety and support support. So we have a team of trained, what we call responders. They're specially trained and have been trained by external specialist agencies. So that's where we've really utilised our partnerships. And we have a team within the university that offer specific and specialist support to students who may disclose that they're being subjected to domestic abuse. It sometimes can be quite complex within the university because often the perpetrator can be another student. So we kind of have really invested in training with staff, and we do actually have an IDVA within our university setting, within our wellbeing services, that is there to shape and enhance the work of the responder. Our student conduct team, which is a really integral part to this safety and support piece, where students can make a complaint about another student. Part of that process is around a risk assessment. So we look at kind of how that safety planning around the student, and also kind of just our referral pathways into external specialist agencies, which is crucial for a student. We can't offer everything. We're an education provider at the end of the day, so having those partnerships into those specialist agencies are key for us, and I think we've really maintained and strengthened that, and through the work that we've done with Shirin and being able to sit on a forum where we feed into this strategy, but also kind of we get that steer and that guidance back has been essential. So next slide, please, Shirin. So just in terms of just in terms of next steps and development, this is something that is in its infancy, I think, within the university, and we've got so much work to do, but it is about identifying best practice within the sector. Also, data is a massive thing for us. The new system that we have will hopefully be able to give data that will be able to understand a prevalence, to identify trends. And I will stop there because I'm being told I've gone way over time, so I'm really sorry.
Thanks very much, Emily. Thank you
No
for
problem.
cutting it short.
It's okay.
Cutting it a bit short at the end. I want to move straight on then to Maureen Connolly. Maureen?
I'll try not to go over. By talking about the key obstacles, I want to identify them early on so that we understand what I'm talking about as we go through. We know that the criminal justice system isn't working for women and children when it comes to dealing with violence against them in the home. Less than 44% of all crime cases get are arrested and prosecuted. There's a shortage of refuge accommodation, lack of family housing, lack of suitable and affordable housing, and the most dangerous time for women and children is when she's planning or just after leaving. And so that the risks involved in not having resources for those women at that point, it would be extremely dangerous. It's also very important that we understand that we don't understand, and quite often as professionals, we don't recognise what it is we're looking at. And that's why capacity control is so important, because it's about that continuum that we need to understand when we're working with victims of domestic abuse. Just a little bit of data just to demonstrate what we've been through, because clearly during the pandemic, domestic abuse was significantly increased. And so we're looking at by the end of this year, this financial year, as these are measured, we're going to have doubled the numbers, almost doubled the numbers of domestic abuse cases that go through to the police. And that therefore impacts upon all of our services, whatever that is, whether it's housing, whether it's children's service, whether it's specialist provisions such as our own. I also want to just draw attention to the change in the numbers going through as high-risk cases. These are cases where the victims are at the highest risk of the most significant harm. And so and in Birmingham, because of the scale of domestic abuse, those thresholds are extremely high. And so we are talking about very vulnerable people. So in 1920, it was 2,230, and in October to September 22, it was over 4,000, and it's about 5,000 in this current period. Who's doing what to who? So we can just clarify that point. These are MARAC cases. We did some analysis with the MARAC data, and we identified that victims were 6%, females were 94%, and LGBT 3%. Of the females, we were able to measure that nearly 40% of those were from Black and minority ethnic communities. We saw that the perpetrator was 94.5%, Females are 5.5%, and it wasn't known in the LGBT cases, it wasn't counted. So what have we done as Birmingham, working together to actually start to address these issues that are here? So one of the things that was mentioned was, and I think this is probably the most significant thing we did over this period, was actually commission the domestic abuse positive pathway, which is where it's a range of services, or we call it one roof almost. They're sort of next to each other down Stud Street. But they're a range of services that included the housing options work, advice and wellbeing, the helpline and web chat. And all of those are access points. And what we've developed there is a pathway to provision across the whole of the city, whatever that is. So if men call us, we can identify their needs and get them to the right organisation. Where trans women have called, we've identified the issues for them and pass them over to the LGBT centre, and we go on and on. So we've got pathways into all provision. And alongside that, what we did as we saw things developing, and we saw that what we were working with primarily was crisis, was try and move into the start of early intervention around that work through the advice and wellbeing work. And so that it incorporates the helpline, but actually gives one-off sessions with a support worker to give advice and information for women to start to make choices. Proud of here is it does prioritise women and children because that's where the risks are, and it does provide space for action. What we're doing is giving women as much information as they can and options available to them to ensure that they can make some safe choices, or safe as they can be. And so it's all about empowerment and safety planning and assisting them to move on. We try to find the balance around the risk assessment versus the needs model, and making it less just procedural tick box. So we're actually really thinking about women's way forward and self-determination. And that's been very important to this. But you can see that we've done a lot of work around women with no recourse to public funds, and we have a service addressing that with government resources to help us get them into a safe place for the night, so a hotel, etc. We've got debt advice, complex needs, family support that came through from the DA Act into resources. We've got support workers, we've got court support, we've got the high risk support, and we also work closely with our partners around bringing together those resources to make sure that we get the best out of it. So we've got some points of contact with Children's Trust. So the way that we work is to try and get everything in one place to actually prevent escalation. And I'm proud to say that there has been some significant success stories that have come out of this over and over and over again. And also that even though we run the Housing Solutions area of work, which is the early part of the statutory duty for Birmingham, we have never had a complaint about the outcome of those meetings ever, not one. And in fact, women do use us, and they end up in further bits of the service, but they know that we're on their side and we won't gatekeep. That's not going to happen. But we actually work with them about what can we do differently, because the idea of homelessness here in the current situation is so awful that for them and their children, that we work with them around what can we do instead. So I think that has been a success story from co-design, trusting the sector to deliver quite an important service on behalf of the city. The new interventions following the DA Act and the new burdens funding is the enormous victory of children being recognised as victims, because that never was the case. And so that was really an important part of this for us. And so from there, we've actually started to have a lot more focus on the needs of individual children, as well as the context of the family, and how women can support children to recover from their experiences. We've been looking at, we're starting the civil orders and wraparound work, and we've got what we call internally we call it complex needs, we don't call it externally. But it's about women and children. They've got very complex needs in their family that are other than the domestic abuse and could escalate and exacerbate problems. So we've been working with families around those needs, including like learning needs. We've got specialists around learning difficulties, around mental health, we've got older women's services and young women's services that sit inside of that. And importantly, one of the things that has been happening is around cultural change. And so trying to share our experience and how we work with women, with other agencies. We sit with Birmingham Children's Trust, local homelessness groups, across primary care, mental health, and mental and sexual health, and in hospitals. And so we're there to support women in the system, but also to share the practice and so that modelling that takes place and our learning on the other side of that from those agencies that we probably were in conflict with for a long time. There's a shared understanding of the challenges, and we're starting to work well on that. I think then the final slide is about the earnings, and you've just seen that model. But I think it probably is the most important thing we can start to think about now, because I think what's worked about the hub is the attempts to bring early intervention and to try and prevent everything being at MARAC level and at homelessness level, because those crises don't work for anybody, and particularly don't work for women and children, as we know that it's really challenging to go into temporary accommodation with shortage of refugees, and you can be living there for many years, like 3 or 4 years, would not be unusual for large families. And so this is a real crisis, and so our commitment is to try and prevent them needing to go through that. So some of the things that we need to be looking at around early intervention for the future, and hopefully in the new strategy as we move forward, I think we've learned a lot in this process to know what's possible to make something work in the next, to try and prevent the need for women to actually need very costly and rations provision. That's the reality. We need to understand that we attempted to buy properties. We were offered some resources by an investor, and we couldn't buy a building to open new refuge in Birmingham. You can't find large properties to become refuges. You can't buy them. As soon as they're on sale, they sell because there's a lot of profit to be made out of this. And so for us, it's very challenging for us to as a sector to actually try and fill that gap, which we really wanted to do. And it is needed. And I'm hoping that the way that we're going to be working in the future around how the exempt provision, that we can end up starting to find ways of actually making a new model work for very vulnerable women and children.
Thanks very much, Maureen. I'm now going to move on, and I will focus in on the members of the committee here. This session is about what lessons can be learned. I know we've not been able to pick up on any questions that members may have had of the speakers, and so if there are questions, this is the point. I'll pick up on the questions as well. I've already got an indication from 5 members, probably everybody, in which case you are going to have to remember that we've actually only got 20 minutes for this session. We're already several minutes into that. We're going to start off with Ewan, but there's a couple of minutes each at the most.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick. I was just interested in the numbers, really, and thank you very much for all your presentations. They were really, really good. It was just about, obviously, lockdown. Sadly, it was no surprise that you'd see a spike in it. And it was sort of 2 questions, really. One is how much, because lockdown, obviously, 47 together, how much of that sort of restart, or was it always there before, but it just became a tipping point? And the other one was just on the university sort of side of things, because modern malls these days, you go in there, it's almost like a large sort of, almost like the style of a hotel room. You'll go in there and there'll be like 4 or 5 bedrooms in there in a communal area. My daughter's sort of 4th year university at the minute, and so sort of went through lockdown. And I was just wondering what the experiences was sort of from professional side for lockdown, because there are a lot of people that you don't really have much choice who you're with. are then sort of locked together in lockdown, and I'm just
It
wondering.
was really fast. It grew almost immediately, and I think what that represented was there was always domestic abuse, and there was probably always violence taking place in the home. But it escalated, and what we saw was a significant increase. We were shocked by it, and so I spoke with the Police and Crime Commissioner's office, and we set up a regional campaign so that women knew where to go, or people knew where to go. So we went to a men's service and the LGBT centre, and everything was involved in that. But it was phenomenal, and the increase of use of weapons, knives, 46% of all knife crime was against women affected by domestic abuse. And so it was about the severity. It was a very nervous time, and we had to do some really good work with it was a couple of sessions where we were talking to police at the door. I've talked to police and the woman at the door of her home and say, take her away now, because this is really serious, and they did. And so, excuse me. And so there was a lot. We had to change our practice very quickly. Birmingham quickly gave us additional resources so we could staff the helpline for several days and set up a new web chat to silent conversations. And so, but it was serious, very, very alarming, and we had to act very quickly to actually fill those holes. And with support of partners and some additional financial resources, we were able to actually put things in place. But there were more women killed during that period of time, and escalation was phenomenal.
So, quick point on the report, which is there's a map there which shows the distribution cases, and it appears that it's just total numbers per ward, but of course we have a mix of 1 and 2 member wards, so it doesn't actually reflect the rate per ward, which means that map is just a little bit misleading. And a couple of points about the relationship with housing. First of all, there's a sort of common issue where in the summary it says council-led injunction for BCC tenants have a 100% success rate. For me, that's a big red flag, because if you never get it wrong, it implies that you're being overcautious in terms of the number of injunctions you put in. It would be interesting to know how many injunctions have actually been made to generate that 100% success rate, to try and unpick that a bit. And finally, just on homelessness, we had a very depressing session yesterday at Housing and Neighbourhoods, showing that the level of people in temporary accommodation is both rising and much higher than the council had been hoping. And while it's particularly depressing to have to say this, given that that's the case and that best efforts don't seem to be reducing it, it becomes more and more important that the location of where people are placed in TA, it meets their needs. Generally, that obviously we try and place people as close to where their support networks and where their kids go to school and so on. But particularly with victims of domestic abuse, that their location takes that into account. And I'm not at the moment. I just get the sense that we are sort of running to keep pace just with the numbers. I'm not sure how much of the where people are actually being placed is reflecting that need, and there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of that in this report. So I just wanted to flag that issue up.
I'm just relying on whoever is the appropriate person to come in. Maureen, you're obviously one of them.
Well, there is very little choice about where women end up because there's very little space. And so on the day, you're fighting for the space rather than where it is. But what we wouldn't want to do is put women in their own community or where she's got access, because the risks have been found, but accessible so that it meets that she's not moved too far so she can actually access it. So I think that's a really important point, because that space for action and networks is crucial, but there is no space and therefore there is no choice. And women are not only being placed in Birmingham, they're being sent around the country. So I wish we could be more selective, but it's just not possible.
If any of the other speakers want to come in, just please indicate. Review.
Yeah, just to say in terms of the point around the percentage of opportunities, I will take that back to colleagues in usual for housing, to get some more clarity around that. So, percentage wise, how they get
Thanks, Deirdre.
Thank you. I'm looking at the slide with the West Midlands Police Sector, and it's got the number of crimes. So, for example, for this year, remember, it's 18,795. Is that individual perpetrators? Or if somebody rings the police about their partner, say 20 times a year, does that go up to 20? And whatever the answer to that is, possibly makes a difference also to the percentages then of charge rate. Does the charge rate mean one person is charged, or if that person has had 100 instances, has the 100 gone in? At the moment, those figures look really bad, that there's a huge number of crimes and a very little number of charges, but I'd like a little more information about them.
I think concerning about that, Councillor, is one, that's only the crime cases. You have to remember there are many, many more that are not crime. The majority aren't. So those are crime cases. There are very few cases, and they will be well known to police, where there are 50, 100 call-outs. And actually, if you don't call the police, if you think they're going to walk away from the front door, you stop calling. So if you call the police and you say, no, he's going to kill me, and they come and then they do nothing, which is what we're seeing here, is they won't call again, because a good service may create more demand, but actually it would be safer. So what we're talking
about, a crime case is.
So what?
Could you explain what a crime is?
It could be a number of things. What they're determining is there is an assault and it generally is quite significant assaults now, because of resources, and we know that, and we all know that, and so it depends on what the evidence is about harm. And it's not usually, we don't get many coercive control cases. So that legislation, which was important to understand domestic abuse, isn't really impacting much on crime rates. So where a woman's frightened for her life, even though he hasn't harmed her, is really, and coercive control is a crime. It's not crime.
Let me bring Nikki in.
There might be a number of different elements in a case as well. So you might have a case where there's a victim and one perpetrator, and what will be recorded is maybe an assault, there may be stalking, there may be harassment, and they will be quite as separate.
So one person might have done 10 of these crimes. That's what I'm trying to get down to. They might, okay.
It probably needs to be presented in a slightly different way, Deirdre, because it is confusing. Frankly, the interpretation of the data may be wrong if it remains presented in that way.
But what I can say about that data is that's just the number of times that these crime things or involved things, there'll be with a lot of victims, there'll be a back catalogue of things that won't have even been reported to the police that time. Where I look at police data, but it might not be the same reality for victims. That's really important to talk to our community services.
Emma?
Thank you for that, and thank you for starting off with acknowledging that there are huge challenges. I mean, my question is around the early intervention. I think it's so vital that at that stage where domestic abuse victims can get that support to get out of a abusive situation. And they can only do that if they know what help is available. And my experience has been that, a lot of people that are in that situation don't know where to turn. You mentioned about a domestic abuse hub. How is that information shared? Because I had my own personal experience with a family member of mine not so long ago, who has now returned back to an abusive relationship because there just wasn't that help available. And even me as a counsellor, I couldn't find, where do I turn? I was calling like several numbers. It was an absolute nightmare. So, which has meant now a mother with 4 children who's, fearful of for her life in this relationship, but because she hasn't got the support out there, she couldn't find it. She thought she was better off in that relationship with her children. So, that's vital. And the other question that I had was around, has any work sort of been done? I know that you've touched on the equalities sort of its impact, but what role intersectionality has on the way that domestic abuse victims are treated when they're reaching out to get help? Thank you.
I think they're really important.
I think
that the sector attempts as far as is possible, and I think we're on almost every site that you can go on as agencies for leading on domestic violence. And there were 3 at the beginning agencies. One was men, one was tried and dispersed accommodation, one was and so it's out there, and I'm disappointed if it's not really accessible. However, saying you can ring our helpline and get through straight away it would be, I wouldn't promise that. And we've got a significant number of staff and volunteer staff in that helpline. And we had 21,000 contacts last year from women. And so you know, these are not small numbers, and like anyone else who runs a helpline, you can't always answer every call. And that's sad, but it's a reality. But I think there's many people who don't get support for lots of different reasons, and one of them might be not being able to get through on the helpline. But we've got a finite amount of staff across the sector, and an extraordinary number of women needing a support service. So I can't promise anything, but I think the thing about intersectionality is really important. And I think there has been a lot of work done that within the sector. And there's a lot of pressure put on by ourselves across the piece in the sector. But I think the statutory sector could learn more from it. And I think there's a real base for us to be sort of sharing that experience about the impact of not understanding what's going on in that family, for whatever the reasons are, is dangerous. And so I think it's a really important point, Councillor.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I suppose this question is going to be for Maureen, really. A lot of the presentation and the document we actually sent out, which has been really excellent, by the way, it's talking about the safety of women and children. I want to sort of ask your opinion about what happens when the abuse, and I'm talking about coercive behaviour and coercive control, is undertaken by an adult child with a developmental disability in the victim's own home. Because in my experience, what tends to happen is the issue is raised, it goes to the police, it then goes to a social worker or a specialist team, safeguarding is brought up, care plans introduced, which then either breaks down because the care agencies aren't able to deal with the case, or the cared for actually says, I don't want to engage in this process anymore. And then because, again, in my opinion, the victim doesn't feel able to abandon their child or effectively throw them out into the community, allows it to continue, and you get the same cases repeating again and again and again. And I'm just wondering what you can potentially suggest to resolve that.
Absolutely right. This is an increasing factor in domestic abuse that we're witnessing as a support agency. And it starts very young as well. It's quite startling how young this starts. And I think that there's been a attempt by Children's Trust, and I can say, but again, it's all about what's available and working at that sharp end of the crisis. I'm seeing this for what it is and what it grows into. And so I do think there is some family support that takes place there around that days. And I know there's some family support, because I do think it needs interventions that try to repair the problem by working with the young person and mom and bringing that together. But once it's got to an adult child, I think it's really an older child, not an adult child, that's a bit of nonsense. An older child, it's quite challenging. Now, one of the things that we set up with New Burdens Funding was this sort of intensive family support because of all of the complexities, and that's one of them that we have started to work with. But it is massively challenging and not easy to resolve. But I think it's something that we need to look at further. But it's really common now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My question is about intervention and prevention. Good. But then, is that technically the causes of domestic abuse or just trying to prevent it? I mean, we need to understand what the causes are rather than treating the symptoms. So that's where we can try to get the rising trend down. If we can find what the causes of domestic abuse are, then try to tackle them and solve them before it leads to domestic abuse. Secondly, I've seen in the report, the domestic abuse is disproportionately higher in some communities than others. Is it down to underreporting in some communities, or there's some particular issues in that particular community? Right? And thirdly, from what I am is presentation, what students at Birmingham University. Recently, we have a large influx, a large number of foreign students. And what I've seen in social media is that they are subject to the modern day slavery and abuse. Is somebody is tackling that as well. And modern slavery, young women report in to get the promise of something else, then they end up being abused and exploited. So there are a number of things there which are actually
Before you respond, Maureen, Emily's gone offline. I don't know whether she's hearing me at all, but just a sort of a prompt, if Emily is hearing me, maybe she wants to come in on that question.
She's offline, she's had to leave.
Okay, she's had to leave. Maureen.
Just to put it in a snapshot, domestic abuse takes place because of women's position in society and has always been thus. Domestic abuse has always existed, but we never talked about it, you know. And it's quite interesting when you look at communities. So I had a visit from some South African women who the way they manage it is when there's domestic abuse taking place down the road, they go out and they get the dustbins and the things out, make a lot of noise and tell them to get out. So there's all sorts of. But it's different in different communities. And Councillor Harmer talked about the locality base. It doesn't mean say domestic abuse. We work in Solihull and they tell us it doesn't happen in South Solihull. It only happens in North Solihull. Now, we know different. And so it's that, but it is because it's women's position in society. And because they can get away with it, it escalates it. So if you can keep doing this and no one acts to protect, it just continues and escalates. And I think that's what we're witnessing here with the data that we're demonstrating is for some period of time, there's been no action taken against perpetrators and therefore it escalates. And it's because they can. And I think I can remember days when there was a 42% arrest and prosecution rate. We're down to less than 4%, whatever the numbers are. Percentage-wise, we have decriminalised violence against women, and that's the problem. A real problem that we've decriminalised it as a society, and we look at and we victim blame as well.
That's not my answer. My answer is: do we know what the major cause of domestic abuse is? So it's not about criminality, and that's a separate issue. It's about if we can find out what the causes of domestic abuse is in the first place. It may be social or something.
It's power.
Yeah.
I think it's power. It's women's position in society and the power relationship that exists that society condones. It's not about just a bad man. I don't think there's just a lot of bad men. I don't believe that. I just think if it's normalised, people do it. You criminalise things that are crimes and act accordingly, it stops. And I always think about plunk click for the older ones in the room. Plunk click every trip. Once we start to criminalise people not putting a seatbelt on, the deaths in cars reduced. I'd like to see the deaths of women in their homes reduced because of that. So I do think it does matter that it's about power, it's about control, it's coercive control, and then it's about how society responds to it.
Okay, no. I'm going to keep. You've had more than your. Shaman, sorry. You had Ravinder. There was an issue around students. I don't know whether you, John, you're going to pick it up.
Yeah, I can pick it up very briefly, Chair. It's a little bit of one removed from the domestic abuse prevention strategy issue, but we are currently working with the universities for the work we do around modern slavery on that very issue. Actually, I had a meeting some weeks ago with some students in this very room on that, so there is work taking place in that as well.
Is there anything, Ravinder?
No, just to say that we are working with all of the universities across Birmingham. There's almost like a partnership with all of the universities to look at the issues that Emily has raised around domestic abuse. And if you think about it, for a lot of young women, that's the first time that they're actually away from home. It's a massive change for them that they're away from home and being exposed to what potentially could be relationships that end up in domestic abuse, or that they have domestic abuse, right at the start of their relationship. So it's a really important time. That's why we've proactively started to work with universities to say, the amount of students that you have coming into Birmingham, or even live in Birmingham but are at university, we need to be proactive in this space and work with those young women in particular.
I think I've picked up, I haven't, I thought I'd picked up on all members of the committee who wanted to, but I'd like to get you in, but I've also got a question myself in the sense that this section was about lessons learned from the current strategy, and the final line was what could be done differently. And frankly, I would like to hear a response to that question. What could be done differently? Because if we're changing or amending strategy, I'd like that question, in a sense, to be answered by some of you who are here as the experts, if you like, in the field. Idris will have to be very quick, as well as Jack, very quick.
Yeah, quick one. Figures on forced marriage and FGM, I would assume that over the last 4 or 5 years, the figures will be coming down. Is that the case, or you get that the steady numbers are going upwards?
I don't think they are coming down. We treat forced marriage and FGM as part of a family abuse. So that's how we treat it. So we see it as part of our DA response. So you can't look at women without looking at the whole picture. And one of those some of those things are FGM and forced marriage in etc. I don't think they are coming down. But they were never enormously reported. We've got a clinic that we work in partnership with in East Birmingham, an FGM clinic, and so nothing's changing in there. And for most women that we worked with, they didn't know their experience. So they didn't know that happened. And so I think there's a lot of unknown, but I do believe that I don't believe that it's gone down in council. The information, I can't say any more than that because it's quite a thing that's. I think we approached it wrong. So the government approached it wrong, and we approached it wrongly. Because most things we do, we start to work with people first and instead of criminalising it too quickly. I'm not saying it's not a crime, and I'm not condoning that, but criminalising it too quickly didn't give us the opportunity to do the work that was necessary on the ground to bring communities with you. Instead, it silenced them. So I think we made a bit of a mistake at that point, and I think it's on catch up now about how we make that change.
Thank you. Vision provided for transgender. What are some of the issues that you find in supporting trans people in this sector, but also on temporary accommodation and refugees? Do you find that the issue of finding spaces for trans people is exacerbated compared to other groups of people?
No, only about 10% of women who want refuge get refuge, and they're the majority. Last year, we had 3 calls from transgender women, and none of them wanted accommodation anyway, because we did dealt with it differently. LGBT Centre picked those up. They didn't want a long-term service, really what they wanted advice and information. We gave some of that on the phone, passed them over to LGBT that have got a more nuanced approach to that than we have. But that's not become an issue at all. I think in the last 3 years, there's been one case where there's a need for homelessness, and we have dispersed accommodation. So if it doesn't work in refugees, where will it work? And it is commissioned accommodation through Trident. Okay, so it's not an issue. It's not been an issue around men. And in fact, there's ample services for men. Men do not have to go without either a support service or get into dispersed accommodation. We turn thousands of women away every year for all of those things.
Maureen, you inspect in your last response, you started in part to answer my question. What could be done differently? I've got 2 to 3 minutes, and that question's still on the table, and I think it's an important one. What could be done differently? Anybody?
Just from the working in the strategic partnership, so I think that's a really important starting point, because no one agency can be responsible for all of this. And I think we have to change how we hear things. I think we have to stop victim blaming, because if you start from the point you're hearing and listening and then trying to resolve things, you get a better outcome, rather than people running around the system trying to get what it is they need. We need everybody to respond in a way that you make assumption that it's real, what it is they actually need from you. You assess the risk properly, and you work in partnership with those agencies that can add value to it. I don't think we can remove it without the criminal justice system actually being put into place that actually responds properly and makes the crime of hurting women and children a crime and actually act accordingly. And we need somewhere for women and children to go, or anybody who needs it. Everybody should have a service that needs it if it's at that stage. But we have to have a collaborative approach. We have to think more creatively about what's available to them. And I think the early intervention model is absolutely fundamental in this, in actually making sure we've looked underneath it all before we end up, let's get them at Tamarack or child protection or wherever it is, that we make it a further challenge for those women and children who are coming forward. So I don't think it's easy. It's not going to go away. There is an awful misogynist atmosphere in, you only have to go onto social media to see that. And so to change this is a massive thing. But as a local authority and the people that live within it, we have to change how we work in partnership and really listen to what they're being told and act upon those things. We have too much of not acting to protect. We don't protect.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to move it on. We've got Nikki Brennan, who's here as the Victims Commissioner in the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner. And Nikki is going to look at some of the successes, challenges and emerging issues.
Thank you for inviting me this morning. I'm not sure if you've had sight of the presentation, but it's on screen there. Just to start by saying, I know how important tackling domestic abuse is to Birmingham City Council, having been the chair of the Domestic Abuse Strategic Shadow Board until last year. And I know there's many passionate people in this council that are working to make decisions like that. My role as Victims Commissioner is to amplify the voice of victims, understand their needs, and enable them to cope and recover from harms they've experienced. So I'm going to highlight some of the work that's been going on at the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, and then highlight some of the challenges moving forward. I'll the details on this slide. This is regarding victim support and IDVA and ISVA uplift. So in 2021, we had 33 IDVAs and ISVAs across the region. And now presently we have increased that to 66 IDVAs and 31.5 ISVAs. So an IDVA is independent domestic violence. You've got the still word. Yeah. No, that's all right. But it's independent.
Nikki, do you mind if I just interrupt? Yeah. Sorry, we didn't get these slides. Certainly from the very back here, it's impossible to read. I wonder, can you send them now? Yeah. Send them to Christian, yes, and we'll get them up on the screen. Yes. Okay.
Christian, can I have your email?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, you got mine. Yeah. Okay, excellent.
It's quite high detail, this is, but basically this slide is saying that the amount of support, especially support that victims of domestic abuse receive has increased across the region, and that includes specialisms for young women, older people, LGBT, language specialisms. Social services throughout. We can wait, or do you want me to carry on?
Yeah, it might be helpful. I think let's get.
Yeah.
If they're sent to Christian will send them on to members, and so we can have it up on our own laptops. Electronically, this shouldn't take too long, but maybe that's wishful thinking on my part.
Already, one of my questions
they've been sent to you now, Christian.
Why domestic abuse high in some communities than the others?
Why is it high in
some communities? Disproportionately high.
Because it's hidden. It's hidden. It's not talked about.
Is it underreporting or is it?
Yeah, I think more is covered there.
No. I've looked at, we look at the census and we look at who lives here. We look at the women coming forward to us and it matches pretty damn well. I don't think it's real. I think we imagine that women are silenced. There's a network of women out there who tell each other about services. I mean, I think that's the most common way of women finding out about service actually counsellor. But the demographics don't tell us that. And that's why we've worked hard to get 60% of our workforce is from BAME communities, so that we bring as many languages, understanding the cultural community in. So don't think that it's hidden necessarily. Some it's more barriers, some communities create barriers, but it's not real that they're not coming forward, because they are.
You got it, Christian?
Should be with you shortly.
Okay, it's being emailed now. I've received it. Okay.
It's all right.
Okay, we've received it, Nikki.
Our commission services, that's a breakdown of the core victims fund and domestic abuse support services fund, including ISBAs for Birmingham, Solihull, Black Country, Coventry and Wolverhampton. And we also provide provision for stalking and harassment services across the West Midlands, which is delivered through Black Country Women's Aid and a forced marriage helpline delivered by Rochdale. Slide. So, something that is very important is buying for services. And if I highlight Roshni, which is a helpline to provide high quality telephone support and signposting to those experiencing risk of forced marriage and honour-based abuse, Roshni is considered one of our buy and for services and can be accessed by individuals aged over 13 and offer living in the West Midlands. Realise the importance of buying for services for minority background individuals to access victim support, especially for groups who may face barriers or those who have less trust in the criminal justice service. For services allows those that have lived experience or from a specific culture to shape a service that best supports their needs. And there are a range of buy and for services commissioned by the PCC that have and continue to support domestic abuse victims and other forms of violence. Science talks about specialist domestic violence courts. As we all know, backlogs have exacerbated the time it takes victims to find justice. Some of great victims living in our region and across the country may wait 5 years to have their case heard, and often it will be pushed back. So a victim will find out in the morning that their case may not be being heard. So you can see why there'll be victim attrition, and some women would not want to go through with a criminal justice outcome. This has influenced an exploration of specialist domestic violence courts by the victim witnesses delivery group to find out if these court formats work effectively. The exploration found insights that should offer aid to the improvement of these courts and their future development. It's been a big area of discussion at the Regional Domestic Abuse Board, and recommendations upon a report are being considered by the Regional Criminal Justice Forum. To slide 6, Domestic Abuse Perpetrator Fund. So the OPCC have put in 5 provisional bids for the Domestic Abuse Provisional Fund for 2023-2025. If I just go through them briefly. The first bid relates to Early Awareness Stalking Intervention, which is known as EASY. The project, funded by the OPCC since 2021, is a multi-agency initiative in the West Midlands between police, a psychological services group and Black Country Women's Aid, and the programme introduced psychological therapy as a remedy for first-time ex-intimate stalking offenders who have come into contact with the police. The second bid is for an in-custody intervention pilot, which will have independent early conversations with all arrested for DA offences within our custody estates. And this will parallel victim support offer that will be delivered by the West Midlands Domestic Abuse Consortium. Bid 3 is a regional behavioural change intervention in a consortium arrangement with Respect for Late National Women's Aid, Richmond Partnership and DA Consortium. Bid 4 is the embedded case management model delivered by Drive. And finally, Bid 5 is a guided intervention and direct brief intervention model delivered between Samwell and Solihull. 7 is something that I think is one of the most important pieces of work that we can do, and that is changing behaviour. So the OPCC is working to tackle harmful sexual attitudes towards women and girls, and this goes on within schools. We have been using Safer Streets funding to help employ mentors that go into school to deliver the Time to Talk project. We went and visited it a couple of weeks ago, and what it does is it's there to address harmful sexual attitudes in boys. The programme focuses on boys within their school setting, helping them to understand org, helping them to learn how to be allies in preventing it, and calling out misogynistic or violent behaviour when they see it. I think anybody that's looking in the news at the moment and having a look on social media can see the rise of social media figures such as Andrew Tate and the risk that they have for our young boys and men. I saw yesterday in the news that 8 out of 10 boys had seen and accessed what Andrew Tate was saying. Now, I'm not saying that Andrew Tate is the problem. He's just a symptom of the problem. And by blocking him and taking him off social media, it will just create another social media star making money out of saying that they should exploit and abuse women. So there needs to be more work done by government on the online harms bill to make sure that none of this messaging is going to it. And also in our schools, in our communities, to talk to young people about the dangers of this man. Something that I think is another big challenge at the moment, and that is the cost of living crisis for victims of domestic abuse. I know this council supported a motion put forward in the December meeting with the recommendations of my report I did into the dangers that the cost of living crisis has for women. We know that financial abuse and domestic abuse go hand in hand. I'll say some of the quotes from that we had through, but this was from the voice of from women at home, stuck in abusive relationships, unable to leave, having child maintenance and child access used against them, being denied food, being denied clothing, and also as well, many respondents thinking that maybe that they should put up with the abuse because what they faced when they left was even harder. 24% of our providers that spoke to us as well said that victims were financially dependent on the abuser, and they felt. And with the recommendations, I know the council supported those recommendations. I'll take us on to other emerging issues. So housing for DA victims, I think, is a huge issue. As you know, and I'm very open about, I was a victim of domestic abuse myself. I lived in a refuge. I think my time living there with my daughter was 7 weeks. Don't want to put you on the spot, Maureen, but I don't think it's 7 weeks now.
I think, unfortunately, the majority return because they don't want to live in institutions. But I mean, I wouldn't say our buildings are like institutions, but it feels like that. But we've had women up to 2 years with large families.
So you have to think as well that bed in there. So when I was there 7 weeks, that refuge space was then available for another victim and family each time. So there's not that move on. Court backlogs and investment in the criminal justice system. If you don't think that your case is going to be heard, or you're not going to be taken seriously, or the amount of disruption that going through with the criminal justice outcome, you may not think it's worth it. So you may not. As I said earlier, cost of living impact on DA providers as well. It's not just victims that are feeling the impact of the cost of living, it's our DA providers. I speak to them every week in our Victims Commission about how difficult they are finding not only their rising costs, but the increased number of victims that they may be supporting. Prevalence of online misogynistic figures, so your Andrew Tates. Also looking at NHS public health responses to victims through treatment, such as sexual health, dental. Are they really trauma informed? What's the journey for somebody that's been a victim or is a survivor? And something else that's very important is no recourse to public funds and how those victims are being failed. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Nikki. I'll move it straight on. So we had Nikki talking about success, challenges and emerging issues from the perspective of the Victims Commissioner. We had a round table which was the members of the council in terms of Councillor Yip, Councillor Jenkins and Councillor Jan. So I'm going to ask, since this is about issues raised at the round table, children as victims, training, housing, MARAC, criminal justice responses, cost of living crisis. Alex, would you like to perhaps lead off on this one?
Thank you, Chair. Just to try and pull some thoughts as well together. So in terms of the meeting that we had at the round table, it was on the 2nd of December. And I see the meetings that we're holding here today as very much severalfold. The first is an opportunity for us all here as scrutiny members to feed into the strategy. So I do want us all to bear that in mind. And secondly, as well for scrutiny chairs individually to hear what's been said, to think about what your own portfolios can carry forward into the next work programme for this revisit in 2021. You see that as twofold. I would encourage all scrutiny chairs just to take this on. And we're very lucky to have the PCC Victims Commission, Nikki Brennan, thank you very much for coming here today, as well as input from the cabinet members. So it is across all levels feeding into the next strategy in 2024. Has authorised us to do here at O&S is to look back to see what lessons have been learnt and also to look forward. And I think it's on the look back that we at the 2nd of December kick-started this discussion. And I think very grateful to see that a lot of what's been talked about and the questions asked as well actually reflect a lot of the points that we've raised as well. So something around the CPS has come up several times. So we've talked especially around non-molestation orders. Nikki's talked very passionately around the difficulties with prosecution, always talks about no further actions, the low prosecution with this not being joined up. And again, Nikki's mentioned, just touched on legal aid and no recourse to public funds. So we see the CPS as one key area and the legal service and prosecutions as part of this preventative strategy that we may need to do a little bit more work on and to really enhance. So that perhaps is one of 7 that we've touched on. Been talked about here at this meeting. So we've talked about temporary accommodation, not being temporary enough, 7 weeks bed blocking. I was lucky enough to go to Birmingham Crisis and we had families who were there for years because they weren't being able to move on. And of course, you're talking about people, for example, who are being relocated to different cities because they're finding a private, unknown address to the perpetrator. So this is again something which we are mindful of and trying to work across county. And what we're finding as people are coming in from different authorities is that they have to start on the housing application from scratch because we don't have that portability. And again, this is something which I've flagged to the cabinet member to see whether it's something that we can look at. The third, which perhaps we haven't really touched on here, is the actual impact of the child, especially education. So again, we've had families coming over from different authorities. They aren't able to find schools close to where they live. They are missing out on education. They're staying at home. There is that impact to the child and the child as a victim in their own right as well. This is something that we are very passionate about as a focus moving forward. So that's around the third. The fourth, and again, it comes around a little bit around what Councillor Brendan's touched on about cost of living crisis. This is an emerging challenge since we had this strategy done a number of years ago as a new extra pressure, a measure of coercion, which victims are suffering. We need to find a way of better combating that. And as Nikki's also said, this has an impact around the financing for organisations and providers. What we picked up in our roundtable is we'd like to see longer term funding. The OPCs need 2-year, 1-year funding. We'd like to see longer length of funding. So to give those organisations the stability to do better work over a long period of time. What's also been touched on is going back around to the prevention strategy. So we see it very much has been talked about today, very much tooling. One around the prevention of getting the courts to really make this as as a priority to say, if you commit these offences, you will be prosecuted, and that is a prevention strategy in its own right. We'll also see is early prevention that we can do on the council side to try and get better education, better learning, better support, and more timely intervention as well, so that if there is an incident, it gets stacked, rolled on for months and months, which then almost becomes as an accepted individual and a lack of response on council. So we do see the strategy as 2 levels. And again, circling back around, so we've got the prevention on the court side, what we can do on our side as well. But as already been talked about again here as well, is putting the voice of victims very much to the heart of everything we do, as Maureen said very eloquently, both at December and here today. Picking up a number of other things that we've talked about more specifically as well, is perhaps training for counsellors. Councillor Zuma mentioned the direct line, perhaps that organisations have a direct line to council. So instead of going through the normal processes of emailing and then waiting and not having an answer, actually it doesn't urgent matter. There should be a direct line that commission services or councillors have that we can say, yes, we need to find this person a discretionary payment for emergency housing right now. So we need to find that way of cutting out the red tape. And that was one of the training as well within councillors, trying to make sure that, as we've all said here, it is everybody's battle, everyone's business, and it is part of everybody's strategy. What we found is that this DA issue, which affects both men and women, there's so many portfolios. So it's incumbent upon us all to see what we can do individually. And I hope again the cabinet member will be able to take this forward. So circling back around to the chair's original question around what we can do better, what we've learned, what we can try and take forward as well. Perhaps you can open up to a wider discussion with others to again more opportunity to feed into the strategy. And I hope officers are taking this O&S to feed in next steps in terms of feeding into the wider process. And again, Chair, the cabinet member, and I'm grateful for the cabinet members. I've had a number of conversations on what we can do short term, medium term, and long term in terms of the strategy. We'll also see how we can start to hold not just the cabinet member community, but also other cabinet members for housing, for education, for example, to account for what they can do.
Thanks very much, Alex. I'm not going to bring John Cotton in just yet. He's got his own little point on the agenda, and therefore he can pick up on those issues when we get to the next steps part of the agenda, John. I'm just going to ask Kerry and Maureen if they want to add to what Alex has said.
Yeah, I mean, Alex has covered an awful lot there, and I'm not going to go over any of that because the discussion at the round table was really informative and really useful, and we've had ongoing discussions. I just wanted to really focus on one of the points around the changing attitudes, and I think both Maureen and Nikki and others have raised this as something that is probably, I think, one of the most important features of tackling domestic abuse in any policy that we have, because it's probably the hardest one, apart from having no money to provide resources, clearly, but changing behaviours and attitude. Because like you said, Maureen, domestic abuse has been around forever, and over the last 35 years in my own experience, it's very difficult to see how things have changed in terms of those attitudes and behaviours. So, I mean, just Nikki raised Andrew Tate, but I mean, just an example of, mainstream media and how they victim blame continually. And we only need to look at the recent headlines around Nicola Bulley. And, and I think as councillors, we have a responsibility to be calling that out. And as a council, we have a responsibility to be calling that out. And I know Nikki calls it out all the time. So for me, it's sort of the challenges and what we can do better is in terms of what we do as councillors, working in our own communities to try and educate and change behaviour, working clearly with partners and with groups in our own communities. And I don't think, that work might go on in some communities and some areas of the city, but we don't take it on board as a whole and go, this is what we're going to do. And Alex raised it in terms of training for counsellors. And I think that is something that could be really important and could actually make a difference. So I'd like to see that somewhere in the strategy that, I mean, we did do some training a few years ago around different things, and it was supposed to be sort of it wasn't mandatory training, but training around these sorts of issues should be mandatory for all councillors, for all elected representatives, I think, because it's so important. And just finally, and you're all very right, it is around the early intervention and prevention, because otherwise it's just a false economy, because we can't wait for that high cost crisis intervention if we're not dealing with preventative work much sooner. And resourcing one it's always been an issue, and it always will be an issue. And I think it's just about recognising that is going to be a hard thing to fix in the current climate, but how we can get other partners on board to help us deliver some of the support that's required. Thanks, Chair.
Maureen?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Eve and to Councillor Jenkins. We did discuss quite a few important information about how we wanted to move forward. And I know I want to thank Maureen, because she did say that she would offer training to all elected members when we did discuss that. Thank you very much for that, Maureen. But also it's about CPS, that every victim should go to CPS, because the reasons why people are being disheartened is because of legal fees as well. Now, I don't know how much this is true, but our organisations, women aid organisations, so forth, receive funding for women, for funding for legal aid to support them and to make sure that this does go forward and the perpetrator does get convicted for whatever. I mean, I think, and overall, the main thing was funding for legal aid. That was the main concern, because a lot of people can't afford to pay solicitors' fees and so forth, and that is a massive barrier to a victim. So I think that wraparound support would need that, and also if certain cases are taking a long time to go to court, and if they did get legal aid for that, would that legal aid still be with them over the duration of the time that it gets to go to court? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I've got time just to take comments from any other members of the committee, or indeed any of the other attendees. Is there any comment that anyone would like to add in at this stage?
I would just like to say on board, and I think that it's a good start to think about membership, the members saying DA and what they're hearing. We should have a no wrongdoing approach.
Maureen?
Thank you, Chair. Maureen, I would like to invite, and I'll send this out all. We've got LPDG, which is local police committee that we sit on. We've got a launch for all 6 wards, and I was wondering if I could send you an invitation. You could have a table there and discuss this with across, as I said, the city, and it'd be interesting for people to come and sit down and have a chat with you and collect some information. And just be a bit more knowledgeable. So I'll send that. I'll invite over. Thank you, Jim.
Shaman?
Yes, I think my question to Maureen and Nikki. For questioning work in the refugees, Maureen, you're going to be very reputable and got a good track record of dealing with these issues, domestic violence, right? But then, like anything else, when the funding comes around, some one-person band or a couple of person bands think it's easy money, rather than spending on what it's intended for, they're lining the out pockets. So how we can make sure that the people, the organizations who are coming forward for the work are obviously checked to say that they're not profiting out of it, of the other people's misery. I mean, I'm talking about some person who probably set up the issue for organizations for doing service, but then they themselves who are delivering it and obviously claiming higher fees and other things. I'm so Nikki.
In terms of anybody that would get funding from the OPCC, there would be a robust monitoring process to make sure that funds is spent in the way.
Yeah. I think there's a reference there, actually, Nikki, to exempt accommodation issues, and that has been a concern. That has been a concern for this committee. In fact, there was a report taken forward by coordinating O&S on exempt accommodation, and we have had follow-up with the exempt accommodation team, and we will be considering that again at some point later on, maybe not this municipal year, but into the next municipal year.
Yes, thanks. It's not just Jim probably saying is some more will come forward saying reach back on this year.
Councillor, I think people think that they hear about this and they want to do something about it. I think there's a lot of individuals that think I could make a difference to people. And I think, I do think that happens. And sometimes I think they're very misguided because I don't think they bring something with them that makes it safe and robust and there's rigour. But I've never heard of any agency that's come across my horizon that set up and then just took lots of money and not done anything with it. That doesn't mean to say it's never happened. The exempt accommodation's crucial around this because they experience abuse by the landlords at times. But I've not heard of that, so I don't want to comment on it. But I don't want to also diss people who are trying to do something, even if it's wrong. It's the right thing for the wrong reason, you know what I mean? I wouldn't like to do that.
I'll take Ravinda and then I'll come to you, Simon.
Yeah, just from a commission perspective, I think we can sort of like touched on it earlier, we do have a robust procurement process that is in place for any provider who wants to come forward and bid for possible funding. And then, having gone through the procurement process and the legal obligations that they have to meet, we then also have contract management. So there's ongoing contract management to make sure that whatever has been put in a bid is actually delivered. So that is our responsibility. We're commissioning officers and contract managers, and we make sure that they deliver to what they say they're going to deliver. And importantly, it's about the quality of the service. So government has recently, in terms of this Part 4 duty and the funding that was released around that, has put in quality standards around the type of support that needs to be put in place. So it's not about sort of saying, I'll do that. There are standards that organisations have to do that support.
Wanted to thank the Task and Finish group for the work that they've done around this, and thank you, Maureen and Nikki and Councillor Cotton. I mean, it's a really important issue to a lot of us, and I would welcome any training, on domestic abuse for councillors, and what Councillor Yip suggested in terms of if there was some sort of one point of sort of contact or something for councillors, that would be a massive help, because we do tend to get a lot of cases, and a lot of us are not we're not qualified in terms of we don't have the knowledge on how to support victims of domestic abuse. So that would be a massive help if there's any information or anything that you've given. I do understand that resources are limited, but thank you for really taking this issue as such a high priority. Thank you.
Yeah, just really quickly on that, on the point that Alex and Simon raised about the point of contact for councillors. I think that is a really good idea, just to make sure that we're signposting to the right levels of support. But I wouldn't want any cases put through prioritised over other women receiving. So it's not giving us a sort of step forward for those women. It's just making sure that those women are signposted to the right support.
Okay, I think I've picked up on all the contributions. Alex, if you want a last word, I've got time for a last word.
I deliberately wanted to keep my remarks short because I'm keen to make sure that all cabinet members, all scrutiny chairs have an opportunity to feed into this strategy. It's important in terms of the preventative limb. I do want to just emphasise what came up very strongly at our roundtable, and what I'm hearing today as well, to try and pull everyone's thoughts together, is the preventative matter. We are seeing people who are being victims and offending at an earlier age. And certainly the two slideshows from Nikki and Maureen as well, you're looking at the trends in terms of 26% 2 years ago, 16% increase this year. It is a year-on-year increase, not just the complexity of offences, but also the number of offences, as Councillor Oldham mentioned. So we do need to get the preventative strategy right. Maybe this one at the moment, we had a number of key themes, key pillars, that we do want to see this preventative being very much the heart of it, as well as the voice of the injured party and the child as well. Those are kind of the parts that we want to tease out of it. What I suggest through the chair is that if we're able to get enough recommendations, I think Nikki came with some very good recommendations that we want to make sure we fold into scrutiny But again, individual scrutiny needs to feed in over the next 9 months or so, which is when this new refresh strategy group starts taking place. Thank you.
Just a quick final.
15 seconds, sorry.
15 seconds, just quick final point. I was just wondering, in terms of like with the school, because it came up with in my child's school where the teacher was talking about choice. So if for people, boys who may have been victims of abuse themselves and then turn around to be perpetrators, is whether they're messaging about you have a choice and really getting that through to them, that you have a choice to either continue, that cycle or change, and really get that messaging across. Sorry, I thought that was a really good discussion that we had in our school.
Thanks, Anna. Note that I try to chair meetings so they keep to the time that's scheduled. Okay, I'm going to move on then to John Cottons, the Cabinet Member, and it's down as next steps, John.
I know the introduction, Chair. Can I just say, first of all, thank you to you and to all the members of the committee for what I think has been a really, really important session. One of the great strengths I was found of scrutiny when I was sat on that side of the table was when scrutiny gets involved in policy development early on, is able to shape things rather than respond reactively to decisions. So I think the input and discussions we've had today, and indeed from the previous working group, were really helpful in terms of shaping a strategy that we can then collectively own. I think one of the really strong messages that's come across quite encouragingly is I think we're all kind of on the same page in our understanding of the challenge and our understanding of what some of those solutions and resolutions and actions need to be. And it is, I will use it as my strapline, the understanding that it is everyone's battle and everyone's business absolutely is clear in this space. I think the point that you made, Alex, around the importance of each individual scrutiny committee reflecting on their areas of responsibility and how they can input into this is also incredibly important. I think one of the big issues that also comes out of this is the need for responsibility for this strategy to be owned, not just by me, who's the cabinet member who lead the domestic abuse services, but also across all cabinet portfolios, indeed across the directors. And then there's a wider responsibility for the city and its partners as well. And we need to be thinking about what do other agencies, not just the public sector, there's responsibility for employers and others here as well about how we're ensuring that we're building that environment that tackles the root causes of domestic abuse as much as the needs of those who self-victims and needing support. And that's an ongoing challenge for the strategy. I do think the other thing that's quite strongly is I'm not sure the attention is the right word, but we know there is an issue in that we have an enormous amount of demand for crisis support, and that has been brought out in all the statistics that we've seen from the police, the demand that's on your services, Maureen, the demand that we know is on council services, and trying to meet that whilst also doing that really important upstream genuine prevention work. And I think that's been one of the difficult balancing acts we've had with the previous round of this strategy, because there has been so much crisis that has to be dealt with immediately. Our ability perhaps to focus on children upstream prevention is sometimes come second because we've been in this space. So again, as we move into the how we manage that balance and really do that upstream prevention, changing those social attitudes and behaviours is going to be key. There was a number of points made around funding. You will be familiar with my routine when the funding for Part 4 duties comes to Cabinet, that so much of this is short term. So Part 4 funding, for comes annually. It has to be spent specifically to crisis end rather than general solution end. So I think there's a set of recommendations we need to be making to government here around make the funding long term, make it sustainable, and enable us to spend that in a way that meets genuine needs locally and enables us to get more into that preventative space. I know it's the same with the pressures that face the PCC and the funding streams that you then are responsible for allocating. The members, again, as has been mentioned, BSRA have made an offer for free training to members. I think a lot more that we can and must do in this space around the training and equipping members to address issues of domestic abuse, whether it's casework that reaches them in the crisis space, or whether it's that broader work we need to do out in the communities around creating safe groups for people to come forward, and also challenging and changing their social attitudes. And that build longer term into the strategy. The point around the one point of contact and the no wrong door, I think, is absolutely key. And again, we need to look at how we can wire that into our systems and processes going forward. Kerry, you're absolutely right that this can't be around a kind of preferential route, because we have to meet need as it presents itself and do that in the appropriate way. But I think there is a thing around ensuring that members are very clear on what the referral routes are, what to do when they're faced with cases, and have that kind of set of tools in their toolbox, if you like, to be able to do that. So, and again, also the point around the external challenges around criminal justice, I'm not going to repeat those points, but I think, again, this is something that we need to be continuing to work on through the strategy. In terms of next steps, you'll see the timelines being set out at the start. There will be a period of wider public consultation and engagement. There's a huge number of other stakeholders who need to be part of this conversation, because the key thing is this is not Birmingham City Council's domestic abuse prevention strategy. It should be the City of Birmingham's domestic abuse prevention strategy. So everyone's got a responsibility and a stake in making that happen. That's what we're trying to foster through that process. Just to conclude, Chair, really keen to take further comments and scrutiny from the scrutiny function as we take this forward. I think we've got to build this together, and we need to work in partnership to ensure we're making a difference for people in this city when it comes to those issues of domestic abuse.
Thanks, John. I'll bring Alex in just a second, but we do have some recommendations that we want to take forward as a committee. And John, I'm going to add to the recommendations, almost as my prerogative as the chair of this committee, that what I would want to do is to ensure that the committee is able to look at the refresh strategy before it comes to Cabinet. Now, at the moment, we understand it's coming to Cabinet in December. We would have to schedule an appropriate meeting of the Coordinating O&S Committee, possibly early November, if we were to have comments, if you like, in a pre-scrutiny meeting, a pre-scrutiny of the Cabinet report, if we were to impact, if you like, on the Cabinet report itself. So we need to firm up a little on the timetable with which you'll be taking all of this forward, so that we can build into the scrutiny timetable for the next municipal year and a meeting appropriate for us to do to have a look at what it is you're intending to bring forward.
Very, very happy to do that, Chair.
Alex.
Thank you, Chair. As the Chair said, it'd be good if we can fit that into the timeline to make sure that we feed that in. There's a couple of points, Chair. So, as has been mentioned, a commitment from the Cabinet member in terms of this direct line, if we can get this up. Second and thirdly, so education is a priority. So what we see is that, for example, children are moving in and they haven't got an education in place. If you were Birmingham looked after child, of course, you're placed higher on the list, on the waiting list. Is there any way that we can look at trying to use children as who flee domestic abuse as a high priority establishment? So if you can take that on, Cabinet member. And then this idea around, if you're on a waiting list at housing, on the housing list at a different authority, if you're moved over to Birmingham, as I understand at the moment, is you don't get your position ported over, so you start getting that. You can try and tinker with that. And short term, like long-term change. And then finally, in terms of longer funding and pots, again, if you could perhaps take this away to see what we can about considering longer term funding as opposed to short.
But need a response. That's there for you.
Okay,
it's there for you and the officers, John, to note. Okay, right. The recommendations are set out in. It will have to be very short.
Very quick, just on the training thing, and probably Christian might be able to confirm this to the committee, that certainly until very recently, we're all members of the LGA, so you can log into the LGA University and they have loads of training stuff online. We don't have to wait for people to organise it. And if councillors really want to, they can log in the LGA University, put in their username and password and download the particular course and watch it. It's about 20 minutes of tests to go along to make sure that you're taking on board the message that's been given. They're pretty good balanced courses. So I'm not saying that you can't have too much, so definitely have people to come in to do stuff. But, you know, the tools are there if councils want to go and look and find out.
Thanks, Ewan. Right, recommendations are before the committee. What I want to do is add to those recommendations that we have a meeting of the committee to look at the cabinet report, the draft cabinet report. Now I can't say any more than that because I need a timetable to which we will work, but my guess is that it might be October or November, and have an appropriately worded sentence added to the recommendations to that effect. Is that it, Alex?
Two suggestions today. Can we also add a line on reviewing the outgoing strategy so we can have lessons learned? Vicky, sorry, Councillor Brendan's recommendations that are quite comprehensive as well. In the round as well. Formally, no.
Well, I'd hope that would be an input from the Police and Crime Commissioner to the Cabinet member.
Recommendation must do.
Okay, with that, agree the recommendation as amended? Yep, good. That allows me to move on then to the scrutiny work programme, item 7. If we won't be very long, if you want to leave, you can, but we'll be over in a few minutes, I hope. The work programme is set out in item 7. There is just an issue, first of all, on coordinating work programme. So that's Appendix 1. We had a very good session on Homes for Ukraine at the end of last week, and there will be a report coming back. I think, given the timetable that we set for that work on Homes for Ukraine, it will come back to the April meeting of coordinating O&S, and so I probably need to firm up a little what we have in the March and April meetings of coordinating to reflect what I've just said about Homes for Ukraine. But if you don't mind, if you leave that to Christian and myself to sort out, we'll just try and ensure that we've got February and March as well balanced as we can. Okay, I think that's all I want to raise in relation to coordinating. Do the chairs of any of the other committees wish to raise anything on their work programmes? Okay, thank you very much. In which case, I can move on to requests for call-in. There are none as far as I know. Other urgent business, there better not be any. It's two past 12.
Well, you control their outlets.
2 minutes past 12, and I'd like to end the meetings by 12 o'clock. Okay, no other business. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Date and time of next meeting. Okay, that's there on the agenda. Thanks.
Chair, right?
Oh, Chair, yes, Chair's, Chair's the, no, okay, thank you.